Here we have two currencies, the Singapore dollar and the Australian dollar. So Singapore dollar, maybe top 10 or so in terms of the currency and how its currency is used in circulation globally. But Singapore itself is a smallish city-state that is a major center for global business. And then we have the Australian dollar. The Australian dollar, the AUD, is top 5 in terms of global currencies, in terms of the amount of circulation that's traded. Australia itself is a big commodity exporter. That represents most of the exports that it does with other countries. So here you are, and you are based in Singapore, but you are headed on a business trip to Australia. And so you want to exchange 1,200 Singapore dollars for Australian dollars. Foreign exchange or Forex quotes, though, are all going to be referenced versus the US dollar. You'll find the spot quote for the Singapore dollar is going to be referenced against the US dollar, and the spot quote for the Australian dollar also referenced against the US dollar. And note also that by convention, some foreign exchange pairs have USD on top. Here, this is actually 76 cents per one Australian dollar. And others have the foreign currency on top and the USD on the bottom. We call these American terms and European terms, respectively. So here are our 3 parameters. Basically, we have 1,200 Singapore dollars. We want to convert them to Australian dollars. And we have these two currencies as referenced as against the US dollar. And so ultimately what we're asking is, what's the cross rate between the Singapore dollar and the Australian dollar? And to do that, we can use a formula. We can take the Singapore dollar versus the US dollar and divide it by the Australian dollar versus the US dollar. Or we can multiply by the Singapore versus the US dollar, multiplied by the US dollar versus the Australian dollar. Either way gets us the same thing. So on the left here, since these are both in the same denominator, they cancel out. And so what we're left with is just the Singapore dollar versus the Australian one. And the same thing on the right side. And so what you're left with is just, again, Singapore versus the Australian dollar. So taking either one of those two approaches, and I'll take the one on the right, we take the spot rate for the Singapore versus the US dollar and multiply by the US dollar versus the Australian dollar. And what that gives us is the cross rate of the Singapore versus the Australian dollar of 1.0315 Singapore dollars to Australian dollars. With that, we can answer the question of how much 1,200 Singapore dollars is in Australian dollars. Since one Singapore dollar is larger in value than a single Australian dollar, I know if I'm going to go from one Singapore dollar to Australian dollars, this number should also be smaller. To make that happen, I'm going to divide by that exchange rate of 1.0315 Australian dollar, Singapore dollars to the Australian one. And that gives me 1,163 Australian dollars. 1,200 Singapore dollars worth a little bit less in numerical value, 1,163 Australian dollars. And so here our formula was just the money to convert in Singapore dollars divided by the cross rate, and that gave us our proceeds.